Hello everybody and welcome back to our channel. We are Brigade of Beans, a diagnosed dissociative identity disorder system. My name is Arka and in this video we're going to be reviewing a piece of DID media called Elle's. This video is actually the first in a series where we're going to be reviewing different pieces of media about dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder, that is the same thing. For each piece of media that we review, we're going to go through 3 points. The first one is, does the system in the piece of media actually meet criteria? Do they have childhood trauma? Do they have alternate identity states? And do they experience amnesia? The second point that we'll be going through is whether or not it falls into stereotypes about DID, specifically the stereotype of evil alters. And the third point is just, did we enjoy it? Did we think it was a good piece of media overall? That is going to be far more subjective, but I think it's worthwhile noting. It's cryptic. I'm going to go over a review of the plot of the 3 books. So, in book 1, the host of the system, they don't use those terms, but I'm going to use those terms, is unaware of the other alters or identity states in the system. She goes to school, she doesn't really notice. She got kicked out of her last school because there was an incident where she punched someone in the face. The book uses hair color to differentiate between the different alters. So all the alters look the same except for their hair color, and when they're fronting throughout the book, it shows the character with different hair color. For example, on this page, brunette is fronting here, and then over here, violet is fronting. So for the system in this book, life starts to get a bit stressful, and the other alters start switching out, which then causes it to become more and more stressful for Rose, the host, and everybody else. And that everybody else includes the different alters, but also the friends and the system's family. The system does also see a therapist. We only have one scene with him, so I can't really remark on whether or not I think it's good therapy or not, because he's only really there for a page. And then throughout the book, there is this man who is following the system and taking photos of him. So they follow him. They end up going to the place where the system is born, because there's some I don't even really remember. I didn't actually read the book. Somebody else in the system did. But there was this thing that happened, and so they went to go and see their gynecologist from when they were born. And so after they leave the gynecologist office, the person who was taking photos of the system earlier in the book is there taking photos again. They chase him down in his car. Still don't know how they managed to chase a speeding car. They got him to stop because they threw stuff in his way. Turns out this guy's a private investigator hired by the system's biological mother. Turns out they're adopted. All this information, finding out they're adopted, sends the system into chaos, and it ends up with an alter who was locked away, fronting. And that's where this book ends. A plot point I forgot from that last book was that the aunt, who the host is really close to, is sick, and between that book and this book, the aunt passes away. And so with all of that stress that is going on, an alter who has been locked away takes control of the system and starts fronting all the time. And this alter is a liar. She is a cheat, she is a manipulator, she steals money, she asks people for loans and then doesn't pay them back. She takes advantage of the system's friend, who is very ditzy and forgetful. And it's just overall really nasty and really mean and not very nice to anyone. And one of the system friends starts to pick up and go, hey, I don't think this is the Elle we're familiar with. And everybody else is like, but they're not behaving like any of the personalities we know. It's because it's personalities that I've never met before. So meanwhile, while all of this chaos is going on externally, internally, in the inner world, Rose, the host, is trying to find her way back to the body. And so she goes on this adventure through the inner world. She ends up going to all of these different locations where the other alters exist internally. And she helps them kind of in different ways. Basically, Blue, who's the alter who's taking control of the body, has set up dangerous things to prevent the other alters from fronting. And so Rose is able to surpass those things because they're not there to target her. And she goes through this big loop. She ends up meeting Green, who's one of the alters in the system who is very silent and withdraws and doesn't really talk to anyone. And Green and Blue they do a full loop, they end up right back where they started, and then they realize that they can go through this hole in the ceiling that they couldn't reach because they can actually fly. I should also mention that throughout the entirety of this book, Rose is hearing in her head the voice of another alter, doesn't realize it's another alter, but there's another voice speaking to her that none of the other alters can hear whilst they're in their own parts of the inner world. Something that I think is quite interesting, and I do like for the most part, is that when the alters start to communicate and start to work together, they each take on a little piece of the other alter's hair color. So you can see in this scene, Blue is fronting and Blue switches out, and then when Rose switches back in, because she's been communicating with Green internally, there is a streak of green in her hair, and Green has a complementary rose streak in her hair. Now, the end of this book is where the series really lost us, because it explains why the system exists. And the system exists because apparently there were 6 embryos in utero who all absorbed together, so they're literally 6 different people. And that's just not how DID works. And that actually made us quite disappointed because we were enjoying the series. We were a bit still cautious because there were alters who were lying and manipulating and kind of being violent and rude towards other people, but realistically that can happen. And then it entirely lost us because that is not how DID forms. For those of you who don't know, dissociative identity disorder is a chronic dissociative disorder that is formed from repetitive, extreme, inescapable abuse and trauma before the ages of 6 to 9. It does not come from embryos fusing together. And I get it, writing about abuse in a book that's targeted towards teens is difficult, and I'm not saying that they needed to do that, but they do touch on heavy topics in the next book. There's even an event that's touched on in the next book that could be classified as traumatic enough to cause the system to split. But no, they went for some fantastical fantasy reason that just isn't why DID forms, and then it's just completely inaccurate and ruins the system rep, in our opinion, because it's not dissociative identity disorder. It's not multiple personality disorder if you fuse together as embryos. And they're portraying this system, even though they're not using specific system language, as someone with DID. And especially for a book that's published after 2020, when there is a lot more awareness about DID now, it's just really fucking disheartening. Which leads us to the final book in the series. Blue, so the alter who was causing havoc, is locked back up in the system. The system kind of goes back to its normal functioning. And there's some discussions between their family and their biological mother, and it turns out that the family doesn't want the system talking to their biological mother because when the system was an infant, their biological mother tried to kidnap them. Now, this event in itself can be traumatic enough to cause the system to form, so I don't understand why they just didn't use that as the catalyst for why the system formed, instead of using multiple embryos fusing together. It doesn't make sense to me. And they kind of do link into the fact that Blonde, who is essentially a physical protector, formed or got her fight back kind of personality from that incident. Even though she didn't split then, that's where she kind of developed into who she is. And they could have just had her split then. It's just frustrating. So the plot of this book is the system internally is trying to find the voice that alters can hear when they're not in their part of the inner world, and they're trying to locate it. And Blue's like, yeah, that's my best friend. And so Rose and Blue and Green go on an adventure to find this voice. And they end up connecting with all of the alters in the system, explaining that they all share a body, and then they all go on this adventure together. And I kind of like this adventure. There are different challenges that the system faces internally that are each designed for each alter to be able to overcome or to use their specific strengths. And so there's a lot of alters sharing skills and teaching each other how to navigate different circumstances and how to survive different kinds of difficulties using their strength, using their calmness, using their compassion, using their empathy. And it can be, it was really good. I really, really enjoyed that part. I can feel Atlas trying to switch in. Give us a moment. It's Atlas. So an example of them working together is they're walking through a desert internally. And what I quite like is whenever we're in the inner world, there is a black border. And then wherever we're in the external world, there's a white border, which I think is a really cool visual clue towards the reader as to which reality we're in. But we're in the inner world, there's quicksand, and they get stuck. And then Green calms down and sinks through it. And so then Green tells the rest of them, well, Green doesn't really speak, but Green cues Rose by tapping on her foot that you need to calm down. Rose explains it to everyone else. Everyone calms down, they sink through the sand, and they pass the challenge because there was a tunnel underneath. And I just think it's really cool as they're going through this and working together. Different alters are taking on different streaks of hair from who they're working with. And I just think that's a really cool visual way to show integration, and just it's really cool to see the system working together. And I really, really genuinely enjoyed that. If only it was actually DID and not a bunch of embryos fusing together. And this is the part where I have to give a trigger warning for suicide. We didn't realize that that was a trigger warning going into this book, but it very much is. So Brunette ends up fronting, and Brunette is an alter that we classify as a trauma holder. She holds a lot of negative emotions. She thinks that people really don't like her, and she also holds a lot of deep, deep empathy for other people, but in a way that is just pain for her. And there ends up being an argument between her parents over, her adoptive parents over her biological mother. She is seeing all of these selfies and posts that other alters made on Instagram that she recognizes aren't her, and she has a crisis, and she ends up taking an overdose and ending up in the hospital. And the rest of the system is unaware of this because they're all internally trying to work towards reaching this voice that they can all hear in the inner world. Whilst the system is in hospital, Green ends up fronting, and Green doesn't talk to anyone. Green does not communicate. Green is very shut off. And so I don't quite know how it happens, but the system ends up in some kind of holiday home with their parents. And so the final scene of the book, the final external scene, is Green sitting beside a pool by herself. Meanwhile, in the inner world, the other alters have finally reached the source of this internal voice. And they discover that it's actually a seventh alter, an embryo fused before the first scan that showed the 6 of them. And this seventh alter is White, and White is a male alter because he existed as an embryo before the genitals formed. That's the exact wording. And yes, you can have alters of different genders. That is very, very common to have alters who look like all different sorts of things. You can have alters that aren't even human. But it's not because of when the embryo was formed or embryos fused together in the womb. That's just not... No. And then externally, Green either falls into the pool because she's being pulled into the inner world and switches, or intentionally falls into the pool and there is nobody in the body. And they're just in the water. And then Green starts yelling at everybody and saying, you're not strong enough, you're weak, these are all the things that are bad about you. And the rest of the alters go, actually, no, these are all things that are good about us. We're made up of all these different things, and we're complicated and we're human, which is true. Everyone's made up of all of these different facets and all of these different elements about themselves, and we're complicated and we're messy. It's true for every single human, not just DID systems. Hello everybody, it is Tempest. Let's wrap up the summary of this book. So, we've got the system who's bodily fallen into the pool. Meanwhile, in the inner world, Green is yelling at everyone, pointing out all their weaknesses. The other alters are going, no, these are our strengths. This is what makes us us. This is why we're important. And then, and the reason that kind of ruined the book for us, they all recognize that they're all important. And despite just being in crisis, despite only just forming internal communication, despite not having any trauma-specific therapy as far as I'm aware, they reach final fusion. They will become one girl who has rainbow hair to represent that all the parts are still part of her. That is true. When you reach final fusion, all the alters who were present are still present in some way, shape, or form. But final fusion does not happen like that. It does not happen instantaneously. It does not happen without work. And it does not happen just because you get communication with everybody. And that's where the book ends. That's the happily ever after. Does the system meet criteria? Almost. They have 2 or more distinct identities. They have 7 distinct identities. They experience amnesia when other alters are fronting. However, it was not caused by childhood trauma, so it does not meet the criteria in that aspect. And whilst that's not part of the written diagnostic criteria, that is the most well-founded and well-understood cause of DID at the current time. And there is absolutely zero evidence that DID is formed by multiple embryos coming together in the womb. If that was the case, I do not know how they managed to be hundreds of embryos that fused into all of us, because that's not possible and not how it happens. Was there an evil alter? Not exactly. There were alters who were harmful to the body. There were alters who were harmful to other people. There was an instance where they punched someone. There were alters who were rude and aggressive and stole and cheated and lied. But there was no murdering done, which is a bonus. And I don't feel as if it really fully was meaning to do the evil alter trope. It was more so these things are happening and it's causing distress to everyone and we need plot points to move the story along. And it is common for there to be alters in the system who might be physically aggressive when triggered, who might withdraw in the way that some alters did, who might harm the body in the way that some alters did, who might have different friends and either forget or not acknowledge the other alters' friends in the same way. However, when that happens, the system is responsible for taking what is known as system accountability. And at no point did I see the system in this series take accountability. I might have missed it, but I did not see them take accountability. I did not see them say sorry for this behavior. It was more so oh, this alter did it and that's just how they are, which is not appropriate. If you have an alter who is harming other people, be that physically by punching them or emotionally or lying to them or stealing from them, then you apologize, you take accountability and you try and prevent it from happening again. And it did not happen. So whilst it did not fall into the evil alter trope, there were still harmful alters and the system did not take accountability, which is not okay. And so whilst it doesn't fall into the evil alter trope, I feel like it does still lend itself to further stigmatizing the disorder, that there's going to be alters who do bad things and that no one in the system is going to apologize for it, because that's not okay behavior. And finally, did we enjoy it? Yes and no. We really, really enjoyed some parts of it. We thought that the art was really pretty. We liked the way that when there was integration and communication and collaboration between alters, they grew little bits of color for each other in their hair. I think that the way that they symbolized alter switching by just changing the hair color is a very good visual cue. But we also didn't like it. We didn't like the lack of system accountability. We didn't like the way that the alters all looked identical except for their hair color, apart from White, who was a guy. That's quite unrealistic. It can happen. I won't say it won't happen, but most systems have a variety of different presentations for the way that alters look. We liked the system working together. We liked the whole adventure and trials in the inner world. Did not like that it was caused by embryos fusing together. Did not like that at all. That made us take like a 4-star read down to a 2-star read. I think we gave one book 2 stars, one book 2.5 stars, and the first book 3 stars because we weren't sure about it yet. And I think it's additionally frustrating for us because it could have been really good. If they'd just used the kidnapping as the trauma and kept everything else the same apart and just cut out the embryo plot line, then it would have been fine. Oh, and cut out the final fusing at the end, because that was also weird. I think it would have been cool if they all got bits of each other's colour in their hair but were still separate, and then we're going to work together. We're going to go tell our therapist about this. Maybe if there was a 4th book, I don't know. They were wrapping up the trilogy. But it's not how it works. That's not how healing works. Healing is not instantaneous just because you acknowledge each other. It takes a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of dedication. And it takes a lot of time. So our overall thoughts and reviews. Overall, I don't think it's good DID rep because it's not accurate. I do think that it's a cool story. I think that it's a neat story. I think that it could be great system rep if a few things were changed. But sadly it wasn't. And overall, I think I'm just going to give it 2.5 out of 5 stars. What's that sound? You were good, but you could have been great. Yeah, that. Thank you all so much for watching. We will be adding to the series. I believe the next piece of media we're going to be reviewing is The Crowded Room. I hope that you all enjoyed, and we will see you next week. Goodbye.